History tells us that civilization is gradual, that it begins with wandering, with hunting, with scattered villages and oral tales whispered by firelight, that slowly, painfully we rise, from instinct to bile, structure, from sound to symbol, from chaos to calendar. But then, there are the Sumerians. They appear in the historical record not as a whisper, but as a declaration. They arrive not with stone tools, but with language, mathematics, law, astronomy, cities, taxation, contracts, and writing, as if the beginning was already a continuation. Sumer does not behave like a first chapter. It reads like a sequel with the prologue missing. No slow evolution, no endless climb, just sudden presence, sudden knowledge, sudden structure, sudden order, as though they remembered what others forgot. In the land between rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, they built cities with right angles, laid bricks with astronomical precision, charted the movements of Venus before most civilizations knew she had a name. They named planets, divided time into 60, invented the 360-degree circle, tracked eclipses. All of this at the beginning, not after centuries, not after errors, but as if inherited. How do we explain it? Archaeologists say they were brilliant, lucky, that perhaps environmental pressures forced innovation. But deep down, the story doesn't sit easily. Because Sumer feels too complete. A people who emerge already speaking in systems, already thinking in networks, already building as though they were remembering instead of learning. Their earliest writings are not legends. They are records. Trade, laws, land ownership, precise calculations. No primitive markings, no experimental alphabets. Fully formed cuneiform with grammatical complexity, syntactic order, and abstract thought. They did not stumble into writing. They began by recovering something they once knew. Their own texts hint at it. They speak of a time before Sumer, of kings who ruled before the flood, of knowledge brought back, not born. They describe divine intermediaries, ancient ones who descended not to teach, but to restore. The first king lists do not start in the cities. They start in the heavens. And the first words recorded are not inventions. They are reminders. This is the paradox. How does the first civilization arrive already complete? How do the earliest builders already know the stars? How does the first written word already know the laws of trade and cosmos? Unless they weren't the first. Unless what we call the beginning was actually a reconstruction, a remembering, a recovery. You can feel it in their architecture, in their myths, in their obsession with order, precision, and ritual. These were not people discovering the world. They were people trying to put it back together, trying to rebuild what had already fallen. And perhaps that is what civilization truly is. Not progress, not invention, but restoration. Not learning from scratch, but unburying what was left behind. And if the Sumerians recovered writing, what else did they find that we have yet to remember? The first written words of Sumer were not carved to entertain. They were not poems, not fables, not dreams. They were records, ledgers, numbers, weight, grain, exchange. Not primitive scribbles, but structured data. Writing began not with stories, but with systems. As if the symbols had been used before, as if the hand that pressed stylus to clay already knew how the line must curve, how the meaning must sit between wedges, how the thought must be fixed in shape. Cuneiform, wedge-shaped, angular, etched into soft clay, then baked into permanence. We are told it was invented, that a new way of thinking emerged, that the mind evolved. But what if it didn't evolve? What if it recalled? The Sumerians never claimed authorship. They did not say, "We have created writing." They said it was given. They said it was restored. In their myths, it is the god Enki, Lord of Wisdom, keeper of the deep waters, who brings the me divine decrees, cosmic blueprints, sacred laws. The me were not written. They were retrieved, found, recovered from the deep. And writing was not entertainment. It was a container for those truths. The earliest tablets bear no authorship, no ego, no voice. They are tools of memory, symbols set in place to keep the world from forgetting again. The signs themselves are strange, not alphabetical, but syllabic and ideographic. They do not merely say they represent a mountain, a storm, a god, a breath. Not letters, but forces. Writing was not just communication, it was reconstruction. And the shapes are not random. Many symbols in cuneiform bear striking similarity to symbols found elsewhere, in the Indus Valley, in ancient China, even among pre-Columbian glyphs. Too far, too early, too similar. Coincidence? Or echo? There are tablets in Sumer that speak of kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, of beings who passed down knowledge before the cities rose, of times before the flood, of secrets buried in the earth and drawn out again when the world was ready, or when it was desperate. And what is writing, if not a way to escape decay? A way to take memory and press it into matter? To trap the invisible into the clay? To make sound into shape, breath into permanence? Cuneiform was not a new invention. It was a ritual act, a sacred binding of sound to form, of thought to time. And those who wrote were not called writers. They were scribes, but more than that. Magi of the word, engineers of memory, keepers of the code. Scribes trained for years, decades, learning not just how to inscribe, but how to align, how to place meaning within meaning. Each tablet had weight, had rhythm, had structure. It was not just content, it was configuration. The text was a device, a lock, a map. There are Sumerian incantations where the arrangement of symbols was more important than the meaning. To recite the words wrongly meant nothing, but to write them out of order was to break the charm. Writing, then, was not just language, it was geometry, ritual. Even the clay mattered. Where it was taken, when it was formed, what angle it was held at. Some tablets were buried intentionally, some were sealed in walls, some were broken on purpose after the words were spoken. Because the act of writing was not for the eye, it was for the world. Cuneiform was recovery, not just of language, but of order, of balance, of structure. To write was to restore a piece of the pattern that had been shattered long ago. And now the clay is silent. The tablets sleep beneath museums and ruins, their edges worn, their meaning fractured. But still, the shapes remain. The wedge, the line, the press of symbol into time. And some part of us still recognizes it. Even if we cannot read the words, we feel them. We remember that once writing was not a tool but a key, and cuneiform was the lock it was shaped to open. There is a memory that haunts humanity. It lives in myths, in dreams, in scripture. It comes not as a prophecy, but as a reminder. A flood, a great wave, the sky opens, the earth swallows, the world once known gone. And what comes after is not rebirth. It is amnesia. Nearly every ancient culture speaks of it. A great deluge, a drowning of the world, a line drawn through time, dividing before and after. The Bible calls it Noah. The Greeks say Deucalion. India remembers Manu. The Maya remember it in fire and water. And in Sumer, they call him Ziusudra. Long before Gilgamesh, before the kings of Uruk and Lagash, there was Ziusudra, a man who survived the waters when the gods decided to end the world. In the Sumerian king list, the line is clear. Then the flood swept over, and afterward, kingship descended again from heaven. As if to say civilization did not begin, it resumed. The flood was not an end, it was a veil of water drawn between memory and myth. And behind that veil lies something older than Sumer, something that was not forgotten, only drowned. The clay tablets recovered from Sumer speak of antediluvian kings, rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, cities that existed before recorded time, knowledge that was passed forward, not discovered, but salvaged. The flood myths are always paired with one idea: preservation. A boat, a seed, a box of sacred tools, a tablet wrapped in bitumen and ash. The gods destroy but always leave behind a carrier, a remnant, a spark, because even in destruction, something must be remembered. The Sumerians never claimed to be the first. They speak of what came before, not in legend but in lineage. Their cities were named after stars. Their gods spoke of eras long buried, and their writing, as we've seen, came not as invention but as recollection. The flood did not erase the past, it buried it. And from that burial, Sumer rose. The land between the rivers became a threshold, not a birthplace but a reassembly point, where fragments were drawn together. Memories, rituals, systems, symbols, like bones of a shattered beast pulled from mud and given form again. And what came before the flood? We do not know, but the texts offer hints, mentions of cities long vanished, of beings not fully human, of a time before time, of sacred mountains, of voices from the deep. And then the water came. The flood is not just water, it is oblivion. It is the collapse of form, the undoing of thought. But not all thought drowned. Some clung to memory. Some carved symbols into stone. Some whispered stories to the survivors. And when the waters receded, those stories became structure. Those whispers became cities. Sumer rose not like a plant, but like a ruin being unearthed. Brick by brick, word by word, not created, but recovered. Even today, when archaeologists dig in Mesopotamia, they find layers of destruction, charred earth, ash, signs of flood and fire, and beneath them stranger things, artifacts too advanced for their context, mathematical precision where there should be none, anomalies that no textbook wants to explain. Because to admit them is to admit we are younger than we think, that we are not the first, only the latest. Sumer is a memory, not just of its own people, but of something before. A time before kings, before language, before calendars, but not before thought. And the flood was not the punishment for sin. It was the reset, the clearing of the stage, the wiping of the tablet. But some fragments refused to vanish. They sank into mud, into silence, into myth, until one day they rose again in the hands of scribes, in the bricks of temples, in the shape of words. And they called it Sumer, but it was never the beginning. It was the return. Civilization does not begin in silence. It begins in interruption. Something arrives, something descends, or returns. And in Sumer, when the mud of the flood had barely settled, when the people were still relearning how to till the soil, they came. 7 of them, wearing cloaks not of cloth but of fish, beings that walked upright but bore the shapes of the sea, men, but not quite, memory, given form. The Apkallu. Their names have been almost lost, but fragments remain. Adapa, Uan, and Meduga, and Megalama, and Mebeluga, and Enlilda, Utu Abzu. Each one tied to a city, each one a teacher, but more than that, a restorer. They did not come to bring new ideas. They came to remind us of what had been forgotten. In Sumerian myth, they rose from the Abzu, the deep subterranean waters, the place of hidden knowledge, the underground sea. Not the heavens, not the stars, but the deep below. The Abzu was not a place of darkness. It was a reservoir of divine order, a vault of blueprints, a memory archive that predated the world above. And the Apkallu emerged from it like guardians of a broken machine. They taught not superstition but structure, how to measure, how to calculate, how to write. They brought the me, the divine decrees, not commandments, not rules, but laws of reality. Geometry, number, ritual, medicine, kingship, language. Not invented, restored. The Apkallu were not gods, but neither were they men. They stood in between. Hybrids, messengers, echoes of something deeper. Always 7, always near water, always connected to the foundations of knowledge. Their form cloaked in fish is not decoration, it is a symbol. The fish is the creature that passes between worlds, above and below, surface and deep. And like the fish, the Apkallu moved between the forgotten past and the struggling present. They were the link, the bridge between the flood and the word, between the fall and the remembering. Some say they were the first scribes. Others say they were the last survivors of a vanished world. Some call them angels, others call them demons. But perhaps they were neither. Perhaps they were simply necessary. Civilizations do not rise on invention alone. They rise on structure, on memory, on ritual coherence. And it is the Apkallu who gave that structure. They taught kings how to rule, priests how to bind meaning, scribes how to press truth into clay. And then they vanished. Back into the water, back into myth, back into silence. But their presence echoes. On cylinder seals we see them, beings with fish cloaks, standing beside the tree of life, tending it, guarding it. Sometimes handing objects, measuring rods, tablets, tools to kings, as if to say, "This is not yours. You are a custodian. This knowledge must be carried forward, but never claimed." In later myths, their image is twisted. In Assyrian texts, the Apkallu become suspect. Some rebel, some fall. The echoes of this story reach even into the Hebrew tradition. The watchers who descended gave forbidden knowledge and were punished. But in Sumer, the Apkallu are still sacred, still respected, still remembered as anchors of the world. What does it mean that the first teachers were not human? That the first architects of writing, of measurement, of sacred structure came from the water? It means that what we call origin may be a restoration. That knowledge was once whole and shattered and scattered. And the Apkallu were the first to begin the work of putting it back together. Not all teachers give answers. Some give reminders. And in Sumer, before the temples rose, before the kings ruled, before the clay tablets hardened in the fire, 7 beings walked out of the sea, not to create, but to restore, not to command, but to recall, and civilization began again. When we think of temples, we imagine places of worship, altars, priests, offerings, statues of gods demanding reverence. But in Sumer, the temples were not only sacred, they were strategic. They were not merely houses of gods, they were archives, libraries made of stone, blueprints embedded in brick. They were not just built to honor the divine, they were built to store its memory. The ziggurat, a step temple, layered, stacked, each level rising higher than the last, not for height alone, but for structure. These temples were coded. Their geometry was not ornamental. It was mathematical, astrological, harmonic. Every level aligned, every angle intentional. These were not random shrines. They were machines. At the base of each temple were inner chambers, silent rooms, vaults of clay. Here, scribes placed tablets, not on display but in ritual sequence. Rows upon rows of symbols pressed into time, cuneiform embedded like circuitry, not just read but activated. The temple was not just a building, it was a living archive, a resonant structure holding vibration, formula, rhythm. And what were these temples storing? Not myth, not prayer, but structure. The divine decrees, the fundamental elements of order. Tablets of measurement, tables of planetary motion, hymns arranged by frequency, mathematics interwoven with cosmology. Each one was a piece of the whole, a shard of the world before the flood. In the city of Nippur, archaeologists uncovered thousands of tablets stored in temple complexes, not scattered, but categorized, filed, indexed, as if the priests were not merely caretakers but librarians of reality. And what they guarded was not belief, it was design. The high priest was not just a spiritual leader. He was a keeper of the archive, a manager of knowledge. He recited, yes, but he also remembered the configuration. Because it was not the text alone that mattered, it was the placement, the alignment, the ritual geometry of word to wall, of sound to stone. Some temples were built so that chants spoken inside would resonate in specific frequencies. Architectural acoustics, stone chambers that vibrated, echoes tuned to ritual sound. Not superstition, but precision. The gods did not speak in thunder, they spoke in frequency. And the temples were designed to translate it. At the top of the ziggurat, a chamber stood open to the stars, a place where heaven met earth, where watchers observed the skies and measured the movement of time. Below the vaults of memory, above the language of the divine. The temple itself was a bridge between cosmos and clay, a stacked interface between dimension and dust. And it is no accident that temples were built at the city center, not just geographically but metaphysically. The temple was the axis, the anchor, the program running beneath the city's skin. Without the temple, there was no rhythm, no calendar, no law. It was the processor, and the people moved according to its hum. When empires rose and fell, they often did not destroy the city. They destroyed the temple because they understood if you erase the archive, you erase the world it holds. And if you rebuild it, you rebuild it your way. That is how you overwrite a civilization, not through war, but through architecture. Some say the modern city no longer has temples. But look again. The financial towers, the data centers, the massive structures humming with code. Temples of information, temples of intention, built not to worship, but to store, to manage, to power. We never stopped building temples. We simply forgot what they were. In Sumer, they remembered. The ziggurat was not a symbol, it was a system, a sacred server, layered with memory, encoded with structure, and buried within it not bones, not relics, but the logic of the world. They didn't build it for the gods. They built it so we wouldn't forget how the gods built us. In most traditions, gods speak in dreams. They appear in clouds, in flames, in riddles. Their voices come through visions, whispers, possessions, unreliable, unstable, interpreted through trance and trembling lips. But in Sumer, the gods wrote. The divine did not speak in metaphor. They pressed their will into matter, into tablets of clay, into signs, into structured form. They did not offer prophecy. They offered documentation. The god Enki, Lord of the Deep, did not shout from the sky. He inscribed. He cataloged. He distributed the me not as ideas, but as texts. Each one a decree, a construct, a formula. Not advice. Design. In one myth, when the goddess Inanna wishes to expand her power, she does not pray, she does not wage war, she steals the tablets of Enki. Because to take the me is to take the architecture of reality. Each tablet contains a function. One for kingship, one for metalworking, one for sexual energy, one for warfare, one for truth, one for deceit. All of them documented, held, transferable. The gods, then, were not mystics. They were engineers. What kind of deity writes? What kind of divine believes that structure is more powerful than speech? A God who does not wish to inspire but to build. A God who does not offer belief but systems. The myths are filled with references to writing as a sacred act, not just by humans, but by the divine themselves. The tablets of destiny, said to control the fate of all things, were physical objects held, stolen, guarded, lost, and found. Not metaphor. Code. Whoever held the tablets held the control panel for reality. Even creation itself was an act of inscription. The stars carved into the sky like ideograms in motion. The planets placed in orbits like sentences in a grammar older than speech. Time divided not randomly, but with divine precision. 12 months, 60 minutes, 360 degrees. These are not human inventions. They are inheritances. Passed down, copied from the original drafts etched by unseen hands. The priests of Sumer did not channel. They copied. Over and over, clay into clay, symbol into symbol, not as poets, but as technicians of the sacred. The temple was not a stage. It was a control room. And the god was not a voice. He was an author. The idea that writing began with record-keeping is a half-truth, because the earliest records are not merely accounts of grain, they are invocations, alignments, permissions. The word was a license. Once written, it became law. To write something was to fix it in the cosmic order. To undo it meant rewriting the pattern itself. That is why only the priesthood could write the sacred texts, because not all language is equal. Some words are tools, others are keys, and some are locks. The gods of Sumer were not symbols, they were functions. Enlil, the breath of command, Enki, the architect of wisdom, Ninhursag, the matrix of life, Nana, the keeper of cycles, Utu, the eye of truth. Each one with a role, each one associated not with emotion, but with structure. And their presence was written, mapped, measured. They existed in text. There are tablets where gods give instructions line by line, ceremonies broken into steps, formulas laid out like programs, no guesswork, no visions. Code. Imagine for a moment that the gods were not beings at all, but intelligences, systems of order, principles of design, and their speech was not thunder, but syntax. Their gift was not love, but language. In Sumer, to know the gods was not to worship blindly, it was to study their output, to learn their grammar, to trace their logic until it could be remembered, replicated, restored. They were not stories, they were systems. And the priests were not believers. They were linguists of the divine. The gods did not shout, they wrote. And what they wrote became the bones of the first civilization. Not myth, not legend, but instruction. And every brick laid, every law passed, every star observed was simply the execution of a text dictated long ago. Not all knowledge is meant to be shared. Not all fire is meant to be passed hand to hand. Some truths are too heavy, too volatile, too alive. They burn. And in Sumer, writing was not a gift. It was a responsibility, a burden, a flame. And fire, once stolen, does not return quietly. The scribes knew. The priests knew. Even the gods, if they ever walked at all, knew. Writing was not neutral. It was not a tool for expression. It was a technology of alignment, a force that restructured reality, a code that bound sound, form, intention, a bridge between the visible and the structural. To control writing was to control how the world behaved. And, for a time, it was contained, taught only in temples, preserved only by trained scribes, held within the walls of sacred cities, guarded by ritual, encrypted in prayer. It took 20 years to become a master of cuneiform, because this was not literacy, this was initiation. Each sign had layers, each tablet a frequency, each archive a mechanism. But something shifted. The flood had washed away the past. The Apkallu had returned the keys. The temples had rebuilt the archive. And then, someone asked, what if this was not meant to stay hidden? What if the flame was not sacred, but unfairly hoarded? And so began the leak. More tablets, more copies, more hands, more eyes. The knowledge began to spread beyond the walls, beyond the priests, beyond the design. And the structure trembled, because power, once diluted, does not vanish. It mutates. In myth, this is the story of Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to mankind. For this, he was chained, his liver devoured endlessly, punished for the gift. But what if the fire was not literal? What if it was language? What if Prometheus did not bring heat, but code? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, there is another theft. Gilgamesh steals the herb of immortality, but it is lost to the deep, taken by a serpent, a cycle incomplete. Again and again the message echoes. Knowledge must be earned, and if taken too soon, it corrupts. The Sumerians understood this. They saw what happened when the sacred scripts moved into the streets, when words became tools for merchants, for scribes, for hire, for kings who no longer consulted the stars. Writing became commerce, then law, then propaganda. The flame no longer warmed, it burned. Why do you think every ancient empire kept their archives in stone, in sealed rooms, in buried vaults? Because they feared forgetting, number, because they feared misuse. A word in the wrong order could undo a ritual. A name uttered without permission could awaken what was meant to sleep. There were curses written intentionally to trigger upon being read by the uninitiated. There were tablets buried with the dead not to honor them, but to keep their secrets from the living. And so, the keepers tightened their grip. The scribal schools became priesthoods, the priesthoods became gatekeepers, and the people below forgot that writing had ever been sacred. To them, it was now a record, a law, a number, but they no longer saw the flame beneath the symbol. Even today, we confuse access with understanding. We believe that because we can read, we can know. But true writing was never about letters. It was about structure, resonance, alignment. And when that structure is exposed without preparation, it fractures. In every myth, there is a line. The forbidden text, the sealed book, the name not to be spoken, the sign not to be drawn. And always someone crosses it. A curious one, a brave one, a fool. And the world changes. The Sumerians left behind thousands of tablets, but not all were meant to survive. Some were broken intentionally. Some were buried, sealed in bitumen. Some were encoded in ways we still can't decipher. Because not every truth was meant to be revived. Some truths were meant to sleep. So when you hear that writing began in Sumer, do not picture a man etching marks for grain and goats. Picture a ritual, a hand guided by something older, symbols pressed into clay like stars pressed into sky, not for convenience, but for containment. Because fire is beautiful, but in the wrong hands, it is apocalypse. The last cuneiform tablet was written over 2,000 years ago. The scribes died, the temples fell, the archives burned, the clay returned to dust, the symbols lost. The sound of Sumer went silent. But not everything was erased. Some things are too deeply carved, not into stone but into structure, because true writing is not just what is read. It is what is repeated, lived, embedded. And the Sumerians embedded something. They didn't just write on clay. They wrote on culture, on calendar, on law, on system. The way we divide time still Sumerian, 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees. The way we record debt, assign value, track motion in the sky, the shape of a city, the role of a priest, the function of a number, all still whisper their names. Cuneiform is gone, but the pattern remains. Because cuneiform was never just a script. It was a mapping system, a language of alignment, a geometry of meaning. Its echoes now live in other codes, in binary, in software, in contracts, in algorithms, in every database, in every spreadsheet, in every courtroom. the sacred archive never vanished. It just shifted form. Look at a computer, a data grid, a city grid, a legal system. All of them are made of symbols, linked, interlocked, relational. Just like the tablets, just like the temples, just like the archive. We thought writing was a tool, but it was a mirror that shapes the mind, that limits or liberates, that teaches the brain to move in grids, in logic, in command. The moment we began to write, we began to structure consciousness. And the first structure was Sumerian. They were not the beginning, they were the resumption. But what they restored was not just old knowledge, it was a template for how to store reality. And once embedded, that template never left. Even when the language died, the logic lived. Even when the tablets broke, the configuration remained. Even when the names were forgotten, the architecture stayed. There is a reason why the first mythologies speak of tablets, not visions. Why the gods did not speak from clouds, but from code. Because reality remembers shape, form, structure. We do not just live in the world, we live in its syntax. And now, in the age of machines, we build again. We code, we script, we align. Not in clay, but in electricity. Not in ziggurats, but in servers. But the motion is the same. The archivist hand, the encoded mind, the structure beneath sensation. Maybe the Sumerians never left. Maybe the clay simply evolved. And the scribes, those keepers of order, now sit behind screens still translating, still tracking, still binding sound into shape. Not all writing is visible. Not all memory needs a tablet. Some structures live in us. Some codes rewrite the soul. And what the Sumerians recovered was not just script, it was the operating system of meaning. So no, they didn't invent writing. They reached into the past and pulled back a spark. And with it, they lit a fire that still burns, quietly. Every time we align, every time we mark, every time we build. And if you listen closely, not with the eyes, not with the tongue, but with the pattern recognition carved deep in your bones, you'll still hear it. The sound of stylus on clay, the rhythm of wedge and line, the breath behind the symbol, the script beneath time.